Am I there? Right, I don't know if anybody will watch this live, but hopefully it will be available on something called replay for 24 hours. Now, I'm going to try not to ramble and get veering off into emotional stuff, but the last few days has been really fucking hard because I tweeted something and was instantly attacked for it. Next day, my agent phoned me up and said, she WhatsApped me and said, you know, take them down or I can't work with you anymore. So I said, no, I'm not taking them down. So she ended our contract. I've since seen that she's posted something distancing herself from me as a transphobe. Now that is so defamatory and inflammatory, and I'm really, really cross about it. So what I tweeted was that I don't believe that humans can change sex.
The way the woman is defined in the Equality Act is perfectly good. It is a female of any age. Another definition is adult human female. But for me, the definition that works best is someone born with a female reproductive system.
When we define the category woman or who is a woman, I think there's two categories. There's women as a biological class and there's women as a political class. And what I'd say about these two categories is they include the same people.
Any men like a leaflet about women's rights? Women's rights in the local elections.
So when we use the word class, we imply that there's a hierarchy which encapsulates structural inequality, the inequality of women and men.
Human beings are a sexually reproducing species. Like loads of other animals and plants, that means that the way we reproduce the next generation is we have two types of individuals, male and female.
There's a sex that produces what are called large gametes, that is ova, eggs, and there's a sex that produces small gametes that are called sperm. The coming together of those two types of gametes produces the embryo that turns into the next human or animal or seed of a plant.
That means that we have two patterns for people. One, the female pattern with a female reproductive system, and the other pattern, the males with the male reproductive system having being able to get someone pregnant.
There are only two reproductive categories. There's only male and female. There's no third sex or fourth sex or fifth sex.
When we say that women are a sex class, it's a way of connecting our biology and the social conditions that are attached to that biology. So biologically, we're either male or female, but society attaches certain roles and stereotypes to that biology.
So when we're thinking about what gender is the cultural meanings of sex. So it's all of the norms and behaviours and rules which are applied by society, by our cultures, to the different sexes, men and women.
Broadly speaking, when people talk about gender, they're referring to the social ideas about how men and women should behave, should dress, what's appropriate for them to do.
But it's not just that there are two boxes of masculinity and femininity applied to men and women. It's that the benefits and punishments for men and women are very different according to those boxes. There's a hierarchy, and women are in the subordinate box or class of that hierarchy, and men in the dominant one.
Come on, ladies, the fight for women's rights is not finished. They're taking them away.
So there's an idea, and it's a term that's used a lot to say someone's sex is assigned at birth. You see that on equalities monitoring forms. You know, what was your sex assigned at birth? And this is an absolute nonsense.
Sex is not assigned at birth. When you are conceived, you are conceived as a male or a female embryo, and that develops into a male or a female fetus, which is the name for what you are when you're still in the womb. And this is noted in, for example, ultrasound scans done about halfway through pregnancy.
And then it's observed again and confirmed at birth, or if someone hasn't had an ultrasound, observed for the first time at birth.
Every society does this. Many women give birth in places where there's no doctor or even midwife there, but people still manage to tell what sex a child is because it's observed through looking at the external genitalia. Our sexed bodies are linked to particular healthcare issues, which means that when I see a set of results from a patient, I need to know what sex they are. In fact, the laboratories adjust the results according to the sex of the patient, so you get an appropriate range of results that's appropriate for that patient. And if you got the wrong sex, the range for the wrong sex, they would actually give you a distorted idea of what was going on.
It's amazing, isn't it, how the rapidity of all this. I look back to, 5 or 6 years ago when this was all quite new, and people hadn't really heard of any of it, and you could have open conversations saying this is all a bit daft, isn't it? You could see it coming, and we fast forward to now. The world is captured by the crazy.
Of the mantra trans women are women for women, well, first of all, it's an absolute nonsense. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, if trans women are women, then they're not trans women. So therefore the statement is women are women. So if trans women are not women, or they're some other type of women, then the question is, what is it about this type of women that makes them distinct from other types of women? And the answer obviously is that they're male, and therefore they're not women because women are female. So if trans women are not male and are women in the way that other women are women, then they're not trans women. And then the statement trans women are women doesn't need to exist. So it's a logical contradiction, right? There has to be a recognition of sex. Trans women are male people who identify as women. That is a different class of things from female people, because female people do not identify as women. Female people are women.
This phrase cis women, it's a linguistic trick because the word woman has had a very stable meaning for centuries, and it means an adult human female. So adding a prefix to it is a way of saying, oh, well, it's not so stable and it actually has to be split up into different categories. So we need to explain it further. And that allows other people into that category. So instead of being a woman being an adult human female, suddenly it includes men who identify as women, it includes trans women. And so we then have to kind of have a marker to show A, that we're actually the biologically female type, and B, that we accept the ideology. So it's wrong on two grounds. One, because it's coerced speech. I mean, I'm not cis. I don't know any woman who describes herself as cis. But it's also wrong just in a linguistic sense, because the word woman is adequate for its job, and it still means the same it always has.
Gender identity is about queer theory, really. So it is an internal sense of being, a subjective sense of knowing your own internal identity, which was a great thought experiment in philosophy. Wonderful, like, to sit around and think about it. The reality is an absolute mess.
I think there's some of it has come from queer theory, which originated in American universities, which is trying to what they call queer the boundaries of categories. I think they argue that you can get rid of the oppression of women, the sex-based oppression of women, by just redefining sex. If you redefine sex so that it's no longer seen as something real, objective, but just a social construct, then why can't you redefine it away? And then maybe you can abolish women's oppression. To me, that doesn't work, because if a woman is being subjected to some of the sex-based oppressive treatments and behaviours that happen to women, for example, female genital mutilation, child marriage, rape, domestic abuse, sexual slavery, etc., which are very real issues all around the world, that woman can't just say, oh, I don't identify as a woman, I'm really a man. She can't abolish the social construct. It's real.
The reason why material sex matters, why biological sex matters, is because there is a huge difference in the way that women and men, boys and girls, are treated. If there was no discrimination, no oppression, no sexual violence, no domestic abuse, no gender-based violence, as it's sometimes called, then it wouldn't really matter who is recorded as who, because we wouldn't need to keep the statistics as to who is being underpaid, who is taking care of the children, who's doing the domestic chores, who's being raped, who's doing the raping. None of that would matter. So we lose a huge amount of knowledge and opportunity to support women and girls if we trump gender identity for sex.
Female people's ability to make claims about their own rights is consistently being contested and undermined, and female people are being monstered because there's all this discourse in our culture that constantly prioritizes the needs of male people over the needs of female people. It's called patriarchy.
So in the past, there were liberation movements like gay liberation, which really got going around the time I went to university. I was a student, and we were, women like me were incredibly supportive of gay men and lesbians because we thought rightly that they didn't have their full rights. This is very different because this is a movement which is asking to take rights away from other women.
No civil rights movement in history has asked for rights as members of another class of people. That is unprecedented.
There's a very, very clear clash of rights. The trans ideology completely denies that, but I think it's actually dishonest to say anything other than this is an attempt at a wholesale taking over of women's rights.
The trans rights movement is asking for the rights of another class of people, and then claiming that if we do not give them the rights of another class of people, that they are being oppressed. That's unprecedented. And it turns out that the rights of the people they're asking for are themselves an oppressed class. And that the members of the group that are demanding those rights are members of the dominant class. So what we have is male people demanding female people's rights.
I made the stupid mistake of feeling that feminism was done and that we had all our rights and we were okay. And then this came along. I'm like, oh shit, maybe not.
The minute that we say that men can identify as women or be identified as women, whether it's self-identity or via a gender recognition certificate, and the minute that we start putting people together by gender rather than as sex, then those places automatically become mixed sex spaces.
Lots of places sex doesn't matter, and it's against the Equalities Act to discriminate on the basis of sex. But the exemptions are in the places where sex does matter. So things like health, prisons, domestic violence refuges, those kinds of places where actually it does matter for women's safety and privacy and fair competition. You make it very difficult if you conflate sex and gender in the law in those places, because that creates confusion in the minds of service providers. Are they allowed to create a service that's single sex? By single sex, do they have to let in people who identify into that sex? And if you do that, if you have your supposedly single sex services that include people of the opposite sex who identify into the sex, it's no longer single sex by default.
The changes in policy are the most interesting ones to watch in women-only spaces, because what we've seen is, although there's been no change in the law, in many spaces, gender self-ID, sex self-ID is already law. So even within the male violence against women movement, there are services that are saying, oh, well, yeah, but we're women only. And they're advertising their spaces or their jobs under the Equality Act, Section 9 or Schedule 3, you know, for women only spaces or for women only staff. And yet then when you just scratch the surface, they then underneath that will say, and by woman we mean anybody who identifies as a woman.
So pronouns, whether someone is a he, she, they, pronouns denote a person's sex. And when we use the opposite sex pronouns for someone, it's quite difficult to be clear about eligibility for certain spaces or services. So accommodation in prisons, for example, or in hospitals or refuges, rape crisis centres and so on. If we are using the terms she to talk about men who identify as women, then that does make it more difficult to make the case for those women-only spaces and services.
So women who've been subjected to male violence need their own spaces, you know, for many different reasons. The first one is trauma. You know, the trauma of experiencing male violence eats away at your body, your soul, your psyche. You know, it gets into your bones. You know, men who are abusive will cause an awful lot of damage physically and emotionally.
If you are in a situation where you've got to be on guard, where you're not relaxed, where you're feeling unsafe, which you might be as a woman who's been abused by a man, then you're not going to be able to process the feelings and the thoughts and what's happened to you and recover.
Sarah's experience was that she was in a women's only counselling group. And I think she asked specifically whether it was women only, and she might have even asked if it was female only. She was told yes. So I think she was in this group for a little while. And then a male joined the group. She felt extremely uncomfortable disclosing her experience with this evidently male person in the room. And so she went to the management and she went to tell them that she felt uncomfortable. And she asked whether it was possible for them to set up a female-only group. So she said, there's also a trans group, right? So they have a trans group and a women's only group. So she was like, okay, so we have a women's only group and a trans group. Can we have a group for female people only? You can keep the women's only group. I'm not trying to get that shut down. You can have a group for self-identified women, but I need a group that has female people only in it. And she volunteered to facilitate it and do the legwork that was necessary to make that happen. And they were basically just like, no, that is out of the question.
Women make choices in how they access healthcare, and often it's very important to women that they have a female carer for intimate care, or a female doctor for a procedure or an examination. Or it might, to put it another way, it might be very important that they don't have a male doctor or a male carer, because women have often experienced all sorts of male intrusion and aggression. You know, even if it's low-level stuff, they just may be more comfortable. And it's not just about safety, it's about privacy, it's about dignity, and women feeling like they are able to have their care in a way that's most comfortable for them.
Sexism and violence against women, they're probably sadly not going to disappear anytime soon, and most women know that. We grow up knowing it. Our behaviour is adapted to account for that, and we just want some certain spaces that we've carved out for ourselves so that we can feel comfortable, so that we have dignity, so that we feel respected as a sex, to remain ours. That's not to say that there shouldn't be spaces, separate spaces for people who are trans, so that they can feel safe, because male violence is also an issue for people who identify as trans, but that shouldn't come at the cost of women as a sex being safe and feeling safe and respected.
Who told you you could redefine the line between your sex and mine? Who told you you could have my rights and that I had to play nice as you guys got in my face and told me I had no place? I'm from the streets, we don't play nice. We tell it to your face when you ain't right. I ain't got no time for this beef about biology. I gotta worry about me and my family and how we're gonna eat. Bruv, you ain't like me. You're from the world above. But don't get me wrong, I will show you love if you know your place. And your place is far, far from my single-sex space.
My interest is personal, as that of an ex-inmate. I served time at this prison and at Askham Grange, where we've also protested. Almost half of men in prison at the moment claiming to be women, are guilty of things like rape, bestiality, paedophilia, crimes that are not female crimes. There is no criteria to determine how dangerous they're going to be in a women's prison, because those sets of questions don't exist to ask them on the way in.
We know that of those who declare themselves to be transgender, with or without a GRC, that they have a hugely disproportionate rate of sex offending, right? We know that somewhere around 50, 54, 52%, so somewhere just over half, have committed a sexual offence against a woman or a child, right? Now, those are the Ministry of Justice's own statistics, right? These aren't ones that we've made up. They're the ones that have been given to us. Of the male prison population generally, about 18% are sex offenders. Of the female prison population, about 2% are sex offenders, because women commit different types of crimes.
So we have women unable to speak up about how threatened, how intimidated they feel, because they will be accused of transphobia and they will have privileges revoked, and so they are frightened to speak up. A lot of the women who've spoken to us have had to do so anonymously because they are frightened of the backlash that they will get within the prisons, and they're also frightened of these men's constant presence.
More than anything else, the kind of compelled pronoun use, this has a cancerous effect on many women in prison. So compelled pronoun use, when you're looking at somebody who physically has the advantage of a male, and you're asking a woman whose life has been marked by violence, asking her to call the person in front of her a she, particularly if that person has been sexually harassing her, is the supreme act of invalidating her experiences.
They're very dangerous, they're predatory, and the risk that they pose is, well, it's unthinkable, and it has become a reality. We've seen, again with the Karen White situation, within 2 weeks of being moved to a women's prison, he sexually assaulted 4 inmates. They will, as soon as they get in there, as soon as they are given the opportunity to access these victims, these vulnerable women, they will do so.
Those women who are there have no control over their life. They cannot control who they associate with. They cannot control their timetable. They cannot control anything. So the state has a huge obligation towards a group of people that they know have profound mental health problems, that have had profound histories of violence. And then to put a male-bodied individual into that prison and say they are a woman, right? words fail me.
The Scottish Prison Service in 2014 introduced a policy for the management of transgender prisoners. And obviously they recognised that there was a need to have a strategy in place for dealing with these sorts of prisoners. Again, an extremely legitimate impetus. But what they did was they only spoke to groups that represented trans people, and they didn't speak to groups that represented women, for example. So what happened was the policy became skewed in favour of the needs and interests of trans prisoners, but didn't look at the impact on female prisoners or female prison officers. Now that came about because a lobby group and wrote about this after the policy had been put in place, and they said that they actually strategized that if they put this sort of policy in place in the prison service, it would be easier to introduce it in other settings. So this was quite a deliberate tactic on their behalf, but really the organisation that we should hold to account and insist remedy this policy is the prison service itself. Really, they should have been taking account of the needs of women, and not just female prisoners, but also female prison officers who now have to perform intimate searches on people who are male. And of course, when that is the policy, it's very hard to challenge that for those individuals.
I mean, throughout my life, I've always known how important single-sex spaces are. I grew up in a Muslim country. I grew up in Libya, where certainly we had single-sex spaces, and if a space that was meant for women had a male in it, those women would simply leave and we wouldn't be able to use that space. When I joined the fire brigade in 2006, I was one of the first firefighters, female firefighters, to be fortunate enough to have at training school my own changing room, my own changing facilities. Previous to that, female firefighters had been forced to get changed with male firefighters to share the same facilities as them, as well as when they were on station having to share the same dormitories and changing facilities with their male colleagues. Now that was hugely problematic for female firefighters. They were experiencing a wide range of issues anyway, being females and in a male-dominated industry. They were obviously experiencing quite a lot of sexism and other issues as well. On top of that, to not have their own privacy and not be able to get changed in private was a massive issue to them. And I know that it did lead to either some firefighters, female firefighters, having to get changed in their cars on some occasions, getting changed in offices, not using the dormitories at all, having to rest in the TV room or in chairs in offices, which are completely inappropriate. And in some cases, women just left the job altogether because it just wasn't an environment that they felt comfortable in. There was times when females were being bullied on station, and one of the ways that they'd be bullied is by the male firefighters entering those female facilities, such as the toilets and the changing rooms, using them when the female was off duty, making a massive mess, leaving pee all over the toilets, etc., just really messing up the area and doing it time and time again. And that was a way that they were bullying these female firefighters, because they knew how important female spaces were to us, and that we'd actually fought for years to get those female spaces.
So public attitudes to trans women in single-sex spaces is an interesting one, because the way that the polls have gone, like the YouGov polls, they started to ask more specific questions of the general public. So initially it was, that's absolutely fine, you know, I don't mind.
Most women are kind and compassionate. So if you survey women and say, how do you feel about trans women sharing women's toilets or whatever, most women will be relaxed and say, that's fine. But if you include in that question, by the way, most people who identify as trans women still have a penis, they haven't had any surgery, they're fully intact, just wearing different clothes, or they might have had taken some hormones. Women then will say, actually, no, I'm not comfortable with that, but for obvious reasons.
What we find is that as people become aware, and as you have the conversation, and as they see examples like, for example, Leah Thomas, they are very much opposed to the idea that anybody could just self-declare themselves a woman and take advantage of women's spaces or women's sport. But it's really about getting people to understand that that is what we are now talking about. We are not talking about a tiny, tiny number of people with very severe gender dysphoria.
The general public don't still think transsexual. So a lot of people still think, oh, you know, trans women will go through surgery and, you know, lots of different changes, and some do, but a lot of the majority don't. And that's where the new kind of gender identity push and the trans umbrella has hugely expanded to include, you know, anyone that says that they are a woman or a man or non-binary. You know, it's become so expansive that I think, you know, generally most people don't really understand what comes under that umbrella, which is effectively, on any given day, you know, what anyone says they are, they are.
The number of people who have a cross-dressing fetish for erotic reasons is far, 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 far greater than people who actually want to go through an entire process of medical and social transition. Once you put all of that under a label of transgenderism, what you're effectively doing is saying that very large numbers of men who cross-dress for erotic purposes have the possibility of being legally considered as women and having access to female people's spaces. And the numbers, the estimates are not clear, but it's somewhere between 2 and 4% of the male population cross-dress. So that's a lot. That's a lot of men.
Well, there's no such thing as lesbian dating sites anymore. You have sites that are marketed at lesbians, but that include men. So a couple of years ago, I was on a dating app called Hinge. I had my profile and it was just lots of pictures of me sitting on various beaches with cocktails, looking a bit gormless. As part of my profile, I had 3 basic comments on it. And I think, I'm just trying to think from memory, the comments were, don't be late. I don't like people being late. Don't judge me for my obsession with Love Island, like Love Island. And you must be a biological female. Now, as soon as I put that up, I was banned, permanently banned from Hinge. And it's clear that they banned me because I put that I was only ever interested in biological female. So here we have, again, in 2022, well, it would have been 2020 at the time, but in 2020, a lesbian is being banned from a dating site because she's saying she's only interested in biological females. It's very sinister.
I think there was a lesbian comedian, I can't remember who, a few years ago, who said, it's not that I don't like penises, I just don't like them on men. And we all thought that was absolutely hilarious because we knew what she meant. What she was saying is that women reject the whole package. If we're lesbians, we don't want to have intimate sexual relationships with men, however they identify, whatever their outward appearance is. And so the last thing that we want to be told is that we should be having sex with a penised person because that penised person decides that they are female. We know the difference. And it's deeply anti-lesbian when we're told that we should be attracted to a gender identity as opposed to a sex or sexual identity. We know why we're lesbians and we know what lesbianism means.
As soon as you change the definition of transsexualism to transgenderism, what you're doing is you're placing large numbers of heterosexual men with an erotic cross-dressing fetish under the banner of trans. Those males are still sexually attracted to women after they transition, but they now think that they're women and they want female sexual partners to validate them, but they want female sexual partners who are attracted to women. That is, their target is lesbian women.
I think the T became part of the LGB in academia and also in America. Not quite certain, but I'm thinking kind of during the noughties, towards the end of the noughties. I used to work for Attitude magazine, for example, and in 2013, I wrote a number of pieces for an issue, and I've been through it. The the letters LGBT appeared in it 3 times, and the rest of the magazine, gay, 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 on every page. So LGBT was not in widespread use in 2013. I think LGB officially became LGBT when Ben Summerskill, the chief executive of Stonewall, stepped down at the beginning of 2014, and his successor, Ruth Hunt, now Baroness Hunt, officially changed the policy.
We did well in this country. We eventually got equal marriage, something that myself and many other gays and lesbians fought for. We got rid of Section 28. Civil partnerships were brought in, fostering and adoption.
Stonewall it really is an incredible organisation. It was set up as a kind of as a posh activist group in 1988, I think, responding to Section 28. And it was always meant to be people in suits who can talk to other people in suits in the corridors of power. And it was designed to be kind of very different to what gay activism had been up till then, which had been quite scary to MPs and peers and so on. And Stonewall, against the odds and to their own amazement, I think, we had a massive, massive array of anti-gay laws, anti-homosexual laws in this country. And I think with the sole exception of equal marriage in Northern Ireland, by the time Ben Summerskill left in 2014, who'd been the chief executive, Stonewall had achieved full legislative equality. And given that they were starting 25 years earlier from basically just Victorian laws, that's a gobsmacking achievement.
What we should have done in this country as a community was then start to focus on other issues that gays and lesbians experience, such as mental health, such as homelessness, such as HIV, many, many other issues, but also internationally. We're still having people being thrown off buildings because they're gay.
But the other way to go, of course, would be to let's find a whole new load of stuff that we can agitate for, we can lobby over and press for legal reform. We've done all the lesbian and gay stuff, so why don't we bolt the trans bit on the end, as well as a whole number of invented other oppressions, like being aromantic and asexual and furry and all the God knows what else is that plus at the end of the alphabet means. And I think Stonewall, saw an opportunity there, and they took it. Because really, if you are an organisation with a staff of not quite sure how many now, but certainly 100 plus, it's quite hard to wind that down, I think, and to say, our work here is done. It takes a big person to do that. And sadly, they were not that big person.
Another thing that I think has been really important has been the premature, if you like, institutionalization of the belief. So there's very good lobbying behind the scenes, and all credit to lobby groups. That's what they're for. They're lobbying for the change they want to see in the world. That's their core purpose. Nobody can fault them for doing it. But what they did was go to major institutions, organisations across the sectors, and convince them that the way forward, the civil justice, the civil rights way forward, the progressive social movement way forward, was this version of gender identity theory, using words that are associated with movements for progressive social change. So using words like trans-inclusive, which, who's going to argue with that? Unless you are doing the careful unpicking of what it means for different groups. So I think that kind of institutional capture, institutions being convinced that they need to accept gender identity theory and that it needs to be baked into their policies, or else they would be trans-exclusionary, and then training their staff accordingly. I think this has been one way in which the belief has taken hold before it's really been examined, before people have had a chance to think through the very major implications of changing the way we think about sex and gender.
In Scotland, we've got many third sector organisations who are almost fully funded, either by the government in Holyrood or by local authorities. Classic example of that would be something like the Equality Network, which is an LGBT organisation, or Engender, which is supposed to be Scotland's feminist organisation.
I think it's absolutely clear that there has been policy capture across Scottish institutions, both public and private, over the last decade, possibly even longer. And I think we can attribute that to what I see as deeply undemocratic processes, whereby groups that claim to represent the trans community, and I have some doubt about whether that they genuinely do represent the trans community, have lobbied government, which is a legitimate activity in a democracy. But unfortunately, government and other public bodies have not considered the needs and rights of other groups.
What we have seen recently when we look at FOIs and how policy is developed is that Scottish Government are almost outsourcing policy to some of these organisations. Civil servants have been getting in touch with officials at these organisations and asking them for guidance and advice on policy that is coming in.
One thing I see actually through my work, a bit of contact, boardroom level, with people who have no interest in this personally, but are aware that there is some kind of row that they don't understand at all, don't especially want to understand, but they know it could be trouble if they're an employer, a large employer, and so they will do whatever they need to do to protect the business. And of course, what do? You get a consultant. You get a diversity consultant. And isn't it lucky that the lobby group which is promoting all of this bullshit is also effectively a diversity consultant? And, if you're a CEO of a blue chip company or something, you don't know that. Why would you? I mean, you didn't know that. Maybe you know it now because it's been in the papers enough. But at the time, you wouldn't have known that. And so you're inviting people in, and Stonewall was, of course, a lovely, fluffy organisation, and it makes you sound nice, makes you sound kind and caring. You get Stonewall in to tell you what to do, and hey presto, you've got a massive takeover.
So I believe it was in about 2018, I had been asked to appear on the Today programme on Radio 4.
Actually, what these gender recognition proposals will allow is exactly what you've said, that men will wake up one day and say, I declare that I'm a woman, and not only will society, not only will society have to accept them as women, but if I challenge that person, so if I'm in a female-only changing area and someone comes in who has self-identified as a woman, yet is clearly a man, if I challenge that person, I would be in breach of the law.
I was aware that Stonewall weren't happy. I know the Pink News kind of put out a hatchet story on me. The I newspaper put out a bit of a hatchet story on me. At the time, I was quite a senior official in the Fire Brigade Union. So I thought the London Fire Brigade, being a member of Stonewall, maybe the Stonewall had reached out to the London Fire Brigade. Didn't really think they would have, but thought, you know what, I'm just going to do a subject information request and see what comes back. So I did one, and this was last year sometime. I did one and it came back within 30 days. And I was utterly shocked with what I found. There was emails between Stonewall staff to each other describing me as a bigot, as transphobic, as a hate preacher. And I found the description of hate preacher quite interesting because I have a Muslim surname, and I remember thinking, I wonder if they're disassociating me with being a hate preacher because my surname is Masood. And then, of course, there was emails between Stonewall and the London Fire Brigade where they're reaching out to them saying that I'm problematic, demanding a meeting with them to take place to discuss me. I was the subject on the agenda. I needed to be discussed. And I think in their words, I needed to be dealt with. Now, the meeting did take place between the London Fire Brigade and Stonewall. But what Stonewall didn't know is by the time the meeting took place, I'd left the London Fire Brigade a week before. For completely unrelated reasons, I'd left to become a barrister. Stonewall wouldn't have known that. So by the time they had the meeting with the London Fire Brigade, they still thought that I was a firefighter working in London. So they had this meeting to deal with me. And it's my, I'm convinced that their intention was to get me sacked.
It's kind of like a spell. I know that part of their brain believes it, but also on the other hand, I also know that humans can perceive the sex of other humans from like 100 paces away within like nanoseconds, right? And I don't believe that they can undo that ability. They know most of the time. They're just pretending that they don't know, or it's very hard for me to understand, but it's like half their brain's in like a spell land, right? So people have to agree to go into the spell land, right? And if they don't agree, then they have to be coerced into pretending to go along with it. And there's no way to do that. You can't enforce reality denial without authoritarianism. It's not possible.
You're gonna die out! You're gonna die out! You're gonna die out! You are ancient history! You are fossils! You are dinosaurs! You have failed!
I'm not sure how many of them really care about trans rights. I don't see many trans people there. I see a lot of men shouting at women and telling them to shut the fuck up.
The way that these events are protested, tend to be protested by trans activists, really is done in a very aggressive way. The intent is to silence debate, silence women, ridicule women, mock women, undermine women, make women feel afraid. And it's actually very masculinized.
We all know it if you're in the debate, but I think if you present it to other people and you show them exactly what type of language these leftist men are using against women, which is slut, whore, death threats, rape threats, over and over and over and over again. That's not a social movement, that's misogyny.
On the one hand, they're doing the whole kind of, we're so vulnerable, we just want to pee, we're a terribly marginalised minority. And on the other hand, they're running around going, we're going to rape you to death with our cocks, enjoy your erasure, we're taking everything from you, there's nothing you can fucking do.
Everything that matters should be up for debate. And women are saying this matters to us as women. And also it matters to young children and young people. Usually it's women who have taken the lead in thinking about things like child safeguarding. So we need to be able to talk about these issues. They're serious and they're important. And there are trans people who agree that we should be talking about it. So the people who are saying it's not up for debate, I don't really know who these people are. I don't know whether, I think one reason is that they're afraid of the debate because they don't have any really sound arguments. They really don't have any good arguments. But also saying it's not up for debate is part of what I mentioned earlier, the cult-like nature of it. You can't discuss this because it's a dogma. It's like a religion. You have to either accept it or not. If you don't accept it, then you are beyond the pale. You're not worthy of being listened to.
So until last summer, for 8 years, I had been the independent chair of the Mayor of London's Violence Against Women and Girls Board, appointed extraordinarily by Boris Johnson. And then I continued under Sadiq Khan. And it was an unpaid position. The point of it was to have an outsider who could represent the views of women in London and women's organisations to the mayor, because the mayor's Office for Policing and Crime is one of the most important funders of organisations like Women's Refuges, organisations that provide services for women. The mayor has repeatedly tweeted on the official account trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary people are non-binary, all gender identities are valid. I mean, it's the usual word salad, but that actually has had a chilling effect on the women's organisations, because they are coming under pressure from outside organisations and groups to say that they will admit men who still have functioning genitalia into spaces for very vulnerable women. So I raised that in a letter to the deputy mayor, got nowhere, wrote to the mayor, got nowhere. I was sacked on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock by email. That was it.
I think it is important to just contextualise why we're here in the car park and not there. And it's because of what Julie was saying. There is a men's rights activist movement that objects to women meeting.
When I go and talk to my community in Darlington, in the northeast, when I talk to young people and young women and women my age, they say, what the hell is this about? I've got no idea what you're talking about. How does this affect us? Trying to get benefits, trying to feed their children, trying to get the police to do something about their violent partner. It's indulgence in the most narcissistic form. Yeah. And we have to say that this is what it is.
Well, this is totally a luxury belief. I mean, you just have to look at the kinds of people who are transitioning, and the children as well. I mean, if you went to a school in, say, I don't know, Hampstead, and you went into a class of 12 and 13-year-old, there's going to be a good chunk of those children who are non-binary or trans or gender fluid or pan-frisexual or whatever it is. Whereas if you went to a school in Tottenham and you went into the same age group class, it's not going to be there, because these are working class families, working class parents who, if little Johnny popped up and said, mummy, I want to be Sarah today, mother's going to go, don't be so ridiculous, get to school. It's a total luxury belief, mostly by, I hate to bring race into it, but mostly middle-class white parents who think their children are special.
Some of the media has taken up the issue about the clash between trans ideology and feminism, women's rights, sex-based rights in the law, and culturally, of course. The notable exception is The Guardian. The Guardian newspaper is led by its US desk, because that's where the advertising revenue, the main traffic, comes from. And what's really interesting about The Guardian US, this is a newspaper I used to write for all the time. It's interesting because the Americans can't seem to differentiate between Trump saying we don't want those trannies in the armed forces, in the military, Trump who actually hates lesbians, gay men, disabled kids, people of colour, immigrants, you name it. So they can't differentiate between actual anti-trans bigotry, which goes hand in hand with anti-lesbian, anti-gay bigotry, and feminists on the left, like myself, that say, no, we cannot possibly use a phrase like her penis when we're talking about a male rapist in a women's prison.
The only thing that's ever happened to me like that, in terms of being asked to change copy or anything like that, was a very bizarre episode with the Financial Times a few weeks ago. I reviewed a book about violence against women, which I didn't like very much. And one of the things I said in the review was that murders of trans women are very rare in this country, in the UK, unlike murders of natal women, which are happening at this rate of 2 or 3 a week. And the copy was signed off, everything was fine. And then out of the blue, I got a phone call saying people at the FT are concerned about this word that you've used. You've said that that murders of trans women are rare, and they feel that's a pejorative word. And could you actually add a phrase to say, but disproportionately high given the number that there are in the country? And I said, well, first of all, we don't know that, because we don't know how many trans-identified people there are in the country. So you can't do that. You can't do the sum. You can't come up with a fraction when you don't know what the figures are. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, how can rare be pejorative? I mean, isn't it a good thing if murder is a rare thing? I mean, isn't that something we'd aim for? And I said, all I can say to you is that we know how many trans-identified people have been murdered in this country since 2009, and it's only 9. I mean, there may be 1 or 2 that haven't been recorded, but the figure we have is 9 in something like 13 years. And what we do know is that no murders of trans people have been recorded in the UK in the last 3 years. And surely that's a good thing too. So I held the line, and in the end, I said, you can't actually add a phrase saying that they're disproportionately affected, because we don't know that that's the case at all. So in the end, they took out the phrase murders of trans women are rare in the UK and just started the sentence by saying women, natal women, biological women are murdered at the rate of 2 or 3 a week. Go figure.
So I worked for the Royal College of Nursing for a couple of years as a part-time policy officer. And in the other days of the week, I spent my time researching issues relating to sex and gender. And about a year in post, I began to write about data and the prisons policy in Scotland, and eventually ended up writing a paper for a peer-reviewed journal, which was accepted on these 2 topics. And the conclusion of that was that women's rights had been overlooked. And being quite an open person, I decided to share that draft paper with my managers at the Royal College. And as a result of that, they called me in and said that I was being investigated. However, they could never tell me exactly what was wrong with the paper, which I found deeply frustrating. And obviously I was extremely fearful about losing my job. So I decided at the very last minute to remove my name from the paper, which was a loss for me. And as it happened, it didn't progress to a full disciplinary. However, what really troubled me was in the aftermath of that procedure, I was asked to divulge a lot of information about the work I was doing outside of my part-time role there. And this was work that I wanted to continue to do, but it was made to feel that it would be impossible for me to do this work. And in the very final meeting I had with her, I said to her, I really couldn't see a way forward here in a way that I could sustain this work alongside my part-time job. And she said to me, Lisa, I think perhaps the best way forward is for you to reflect on your values and to consider whether your values are aligned with the equality and diversity strategy at the Royal College. And I was really upset and furious. And I went to read that equality strategy, and I upheld all of the principles in there, and I said as much. So I concluded that I couldn't any longer work there, because I was fearful that if I continued to do this other work on sex and gender, I would just end up in the same situation a few months or a few years later. And that felt intolerable to me. And I was in a very fortunate position where I was able to resign and walk away from that job.
So transgender rights, I would say, and I think a commonly understood way to understand those would be the rights of people who identify as transgender to live their life free from harassment and victimization and discrimination with dignity and respect, which I would, of course, support, and universities should support. You know, universities as workplaces are obliged to support that view of transgender rights, but I also think they should. What has happened, however, is that some of the lobby groups in the space and some academics have used that term transgender rights and applied it to gender identity theory. So have said that there should be consensus not only that universities treat transgender identifying people well, but that as part of that commitment, they should not allow any discussion of gender identity theory other than discussion that promotes it. So it's okay to promote the theory uncritically. It's not okay to critique it, because critiquing it, in the words of the lobby groups, is dangerous and damaging to transgender people and makes them unsafe on campus.
As I see it, the fundamental job of a social scientist particularly is to ask questions, to try and figure out how we got to be as we are now, to be able to describe the world and be able to ask questions about it. Now, the accusation of transphobia functions precisely to shut that question down.
A transphobe is any human being that understands that humans are a sexually dimorphic species and thinks that that might have any relevance whatsoever to any area of human life.
They're meant to be generators of ideas. They're meant to be generators of discussion. They're meant to be places where we produce knowledge.
But for me, the absolutely core purpose is the pursuit of truth through inquiry and investigation and debate without political interference.
They have almost singularly failed to actually stand up for the values that a university is supposed to stand up for, and do what a university is supposed to do, which is interrogate public discourse. Really, if humanities academics are going to serve any useful function and we don't hold public discourse to account, I'm really not sure what we're doing.
Most people, I think, who've engaged with this topic at all are aware of the high-profile cases. So people are aware of what's happened to Professor Kathleen Stock in Sussex, which was dreadful. You know, over a period of time, she was subject to quite a lot of pushback and abuse, culminating in masked protesters on her campus. I gather the tunnel through which she entered campus was plastered with posters with her picture calling for her to be fired.
The idea behind the Gender Critical Research Network was a really simple one, and that was to gather a group of academics, both at the OU and across the country, if not internationally, to gather a group of people who are interested to ask a very simple question. How, why, and where does biological sex matter? That's all. I mean, it's a really simple question. But oh my, the backlash was extraordinary. I knew there would be a backlash. I never expected it would come in the shape that it did. There was an open letter that was placed on Google Docs denouncing us, asking the university to disaffiliate itself from the Gender Critical Research Network. That open letter attracted over 360 signatures of Open University staff, not students, right? Staff, most of them academics.
I have colleagues with whom I worked quite closely in the past, who've either stopped talking to me altogether or will say to me, Shireen, I can't be seen with you. So I can meet with you off campus, we can meet and have a cup of coffee off campus, but I can't be seen with you.
Our union at the Open University were trying to say that academic freedom needed to be curtailed according to this, that, or the other political ideology. In particular, that academic freedom for gender-critical academics needed to be curtailed. And there was one union meeting. I was at that time a member of UCU. I no longer am. I was a member, and there was one particular meeting that was just appalling. I've never known anything like it coming in a university. People who were called, or as gender critical scholars, we were likened to Holocaust deniers. We were likened to being responsible for genocide. I mean, it was absolutely appalling.
You do not have to use that level of hyperbolic propagandist, guilt by association, demonizing all of your critics, if the things that you're saying make sense.
I've been a very active member of UCU. So I've been somebody who's been on my branch committee. Every university has its own branch, and that branch will have officers and committee. So most years I've either been a branch officer or at least a branch committee member. All the time I've been in universities, I've been a workplace representative, which means I've represented people who have workplace issues. And I've also done local negotiations with management. So I come at this as a lifelong trade unionist, a very active trade unionist. I believe passionately that everybody should be in the trade union that negotiates their pay and conditions. That is my background. I left UCU at the end of last year. And that was a really big thing for me. It broke my heart to leave. It's not something I would ever have imagined doing.
Back in the day, in the 1980s, when I was a student and encountering, racism in thoughts for the first time and encountering racist criminology and sexist criminology, what we didn't do was tell people they weren't allowed to speak. What we did do was challenge them, right? We didn't try and block them from speaking. We tried to challenge them because we were taught how to think. So we tried to deconstruct those arguments and show them not to be the case. In other words, we engaged in debate.
But also I think it teaches students that not only is this particular theory unassailable and you have to believe it, but there are such things in universities as theories that have to be accepted as unassailable truth, as unassailable fact. And I think that's a really, really problematic message to give students who are coming through universities, who are the next generation of public sector workers, private sector workers, professionals. They're all coming through believing that gender identity theory at the moment should be beyond question, but that who knows what the next theory will be that will present itself as unassailable. And they're learning that there are theories that you cannot critique, you cannot discuss, you cannot debate according to normal academic conventions.
This whole right side of history thing, that's a liberal narrative. That's a liberal progress narrative in and of itself. Things improve and then they get worse, and then they improve and then they get worse. At the moment, we're in a period of history where things are manifestly getting worse along kind of multiple different axes. Cost of living, environmental crisis, housing crisis, rise of the far right, capitalism's like broken and is falling apart. And then we have this kind of actually quite toxic distortion of traditionally what's supposedly left-wing politics, but isn't remotely left-wing politics and is actually just like neoliberal individualism repackaged as leftism.
The fact that it originated in North America isn't surprising. It seems to me it's a version of the American dream. Any individual can do what they want to do out of context. In a 21st century incarnation of that. And now medical science can make you that person irrespective of your sexed body. They can change your sexed body. They can liberate you from your sexed body and make you who you want to be, who you always are. I don't think that's left-wing in any way. I think that's much more right-wing.
And I hesitate to call it the left because for me it's not the left. It's just misogyny under the umbrella of progression. How can it be a left-wing movement when I'm being told as a black lesbian that I can't date someone of my choice, that I have to consider biological men? That's not socialism. That's not what being on the left means.
And what's been quite shocking has been the number of people who call themselves socialists, who'll stand up on any issue under the sun, who've disappeared when it comes to the issue of women's rights. And I think it's partly because there's been such a brilliant job done by organisations like Stonewall in promoting trans rights as a Be Kind movement, which automatically means that anyone saying, hang on, there might be an issue here with women's rights, there might be a conflict, we might need to have a conversation, I do have some concerns, automatically becomes unkind.
Of course it's a men's rights issue. I mean, we barely ever talk about trans men unless they have a baby, and then that's just the same old, isn't it? It's always about the stunning and brave trans women who are men that get to do everything, get to go into our spaces, get to go into our rape centres, get to take our political spots, get to take our sports spots, get to take our language, like everything.
But I do think it's appealing to a lot of people on the left because we've got quite a strong default. I'm a left-winger, I'm a Labour member. I default to always with the oppressed, never with the oppressor. We've all got that strong default. And when you first hear gender identity theory, when you first hear about it, you think, well, it's about transgender identifying people, it's about an oppressed minority. Who wouldn't want an oppressed minority to have better rights, to have a better life, to have provisions? That's what you default to. If you then start to think about the implications of it, if you then start to think through the consequences beyond let's be kind and let's sympathise with the oppressed and let's do what we can to end oppression, if you then start thinking about possible conflicts of interest, what does this mean for domestic violence refuges if male people can identify into them? What does this mean for sporting competition if people who've been through male puberty can be part of the women's competition? If you start to have those thoughts, what then comes in is this view that there can be no debate.
Everybody that hasn't said anything about actually, do you know what, we do need to have this debate, there are valid issues here, is complicit as far as I'm concerned. And they avoid the topic so much that it's painful to watch. It's painful to watch a QC not being able to say that women don't have penises. That's painful. Not for me, for him.
So a woman can have a penis?
Look, I'm not
I don't think we can conduct this debate with, you know.
Sorry, have I offended you in some way?
No. It's just no. I just.
A woman can have a penis.
I don't think that discussing this issue in this way helps anyone in the long run. What I want to see.
I think most of us were barely aware that trans ideology and gender ideology was getting this grip on the Labour Party. It began to emerge when, suddenly Labour frontbenchers got nervous when you asked them questions about what is a woman, or can a woman have a penis? Questions I never thought to ask leading people in the Labour Party. I mean, can you imagine asking Barbara Castle, "Hello, Barbara, do you think that a woman can have a penis?" Oh.
I suppose when we talk about the left, if we're talking about the modern left, the left that we have now, the Labour Party, which is very different from the left, you have a Labour Party that is similar to what they did during Brexit, is that they appeal to their membership, not their electorate. And the membership, I call them the Islington elite. They're all well and good, but they're not going to get you elected, because the membership are very different to the makeup of the country. And that's why Labour lost so many red wall seats during the last general election. And that's why Labour now are hemorrhaging female voters. I'm a Labour member, they're going to kick me out soon, I'm sure, but I'm staying put until they do. But if you can't get me, a black lesbian socialist, to vote for you, you're in massive trouble.
So they're keeping ordinary working class women out of the party. And you can hear from my accent, I'm from the north, from areas where they're losing votes. It's not going to do them any favours. Labour need to have the guts to say that we all should be able to live our life free from discrimination. We all should be able to live our lives free from fear. But that doesn't mean to say that we need to change one person's or one group of people's set of rights in a way that undermine the rights of another set of people. And transgender extremist ideology is a threat to women's sex-based rights and protections.
It's women who've lost their jobs. It's women who've been threatened with rape. It's women who've been called names and abused online. And the Labour Party has not only turned a blind eye to that, but has actually supported the bullying of women within the party and the bullying of women out of the party as well.
This has actually split the Labour Party. It's splitting the Greens. It's splitting the Lib Dems.
Can you explain to people watching what is wrong with the phrase woman, adult, human, female? What's wrong with that?
Well, I mean, the phrase actually doesn't really encapsulate the debate, to be honest. That's what's the problem with it. The issue...
Centre-left, supposedly left parties are absolutely riven by disagreements. The atmosphere is completely toxic, and that's going to turn off voters. And it seems to me that the Conservatives have been very, they're not very clever about much, but they're clever about this, because they don't lose anything if Boris Johnson or Liz Truss or any leading figure says, men should not be competing in women's sports. Of course, women don't have a penis. That's actually what a lot of people want to hear. We're just hearing it from the wrong people.
I'm a radical feminist, eco-feminist, and a Marxist, and I keep being told that I'm a Nazi because I think that male people are male people and female people are female people, and that material reality is is necessary to explain the structure of exploitation, and that you can't explain the structures of exploitation without materialist analysis. Like, duh.
What the Scottish Government has tried to do is a pattern that we've seen in other countries like Norway. So they wanted to bring in the Hate Crime Act, which they brought in last year. And this protects a lot of protective characteristics, but it does not protect sex.
In recent hate crime legislation in Scotland, the definition of transgender identity includes a person who cross-dresses. Now, nowhere is that made clear what that might be. One has to assume that largely is capturing men, because how would a woman cross-dress? Women habitually switch between wearing trousers and skirts, don't wear makeup, do wear makeup. But that was never spelled out when the legislation was going through. It also protects a non-binary person? Again, not made clear what that means. How would you know that you were perpetrating a hate crime against a non-binary person? If you cannot define it, how on earth are you going to communicate that to the public who are subject to this law and for whom this could end up as a criminal offence? So this is really unacceptable. Politicians need to think very carefully when they're making law, to be very clear about the terms and the definitions that they're using.
There's a woman currently in Norway who faces 3 years in prison. And the pattern in Norway is very similar to the pattern we've seen in Scotland, that they brought in hate crime and they brought in gender recognition, self-identification. And so then it became hate crime for women to challenge the identity of men who claim to be women.
I do remember listening to something on Radio 4 where a bunch of young trans kids were being interviewed, and it was, at that time, it was a very new phenomenon. So I'm thinking it was 2013 or 14 or something. And they were being interviewed sympathetically, and what's going on and why did you make this decision? And one of them said, well, I kind of had been a girl, and I realized I was attracted to other girls, and I thought, this is horrendous, this is a terrible, terrible problem. And then suddenly somebody said, but there's a good reason for it, you're actually a boy. And I was pretty shocked by that, because whilst I know that is very clearly a narrative now, we're very familiar with this, it was the fact that it went so unchallenged, that this was the most normal thing in the world to say. And all the interviewer needed to do was to say, but couldn't you just have been a lesbian? Why did you not go down that route?
It's interesting the way that we talk about identity, gender identity, and how so many young women at the moment are presenting at gender clinics saying that they're non-binary or that they wish to be trans men. And I think this is because girlhood and puberty and being a young woman under patriarchy, particularly today, is very, very hard. But these young women cannot identify out of misogyny and out of sexual violence, because this is what they are being targeted with day in, day out. So they can identify how they like, but men will still prey upon them if they are abusive, violent men. And what we need to be doing is equipping young women, women everywhere, to deal with girlhood, to deal with womanhood. And rather than congratulating or lauding a surgeon for removing the healthy breast tissue of young women because they wish to opt out of womanhood, we should be asking why we don't call that a form of secondary self-harming. It is to do with self-harming, in my view.
Who would want to be a woman in the world today? I mean, it's basically, pop culture is like an inch away from porn, and porn is about rape, abuse and humiliation of women now, and that is basically pop culture. And unless you want to be submissive, be nice, be kind, do what men say, give your body to everyone, then like that's what the world's saying women have to be. Even trans ideology, the men that want to be women, they say that they want to be oppressed, they want to be fuckholes. That's what they say women are. So why would a young girl want to be a woman in this world now? I wouldn't. It's hard. It's hard to be a woman now. And yeah, it's easy way out. To pretend you're not one, but that's not going to fix any of your problems.
There's been a massive increase in the number of girls that are referred. So now over 80% of the referrals are young girls who aren't happy with their bodies and who are looking to, they've been online, a lot of them, and they've been encouraged online to start on a path of first social transition at school with a change of name, change of clothes, and then that inevitably leads to the medical pathway of puberty blocking hormones and then cross-sex hormones later on, perhaps surgery, double mastectomy, etc.
I think it really benefits the medical gender industry, who are making billions out of providing puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones and surgery, because it suits them, and that there's an ideology that says that if you really want to behave and be and identify with a different gender, you have to make your body, change your body. And that's because they are linking sex with gender very closely. You separate sex from gender, you can behave in any gendered way you like, you can still retain your sex-based body. And this is something that these people who are making millions out of it don't want us to understand.
Experimenting is fine. That I think that's the crucial point. As long as you don't do anything that is irreversible, then is it really a problem? Probably not. But it's the reversibility which is the contested area. And we're seeing the trans movement, and we're seeing very, very ignorant politicians asserting that puberty blockers are completely reversible. Evidence is beginning to drip through, which shows, for example, that you could have massive problems with osteoporosis at the age of 17, a disease, brittle bone disease, which normally affects people of 50 or 60.
So for about 70 years or so, young children have been diagnosed with a condition that's become known as childhood gender dysphoria. What has been, until very recently, the medical protocol with these children is to treat them with understanding. It must be a very difficult thing to go through your childhood believing that you should be of the opposite sex, believing that you are of the opposite sex. It's something that children do need help with. But the help that's been given in the past is to say to them, yes, this is very difficult. We'll change the environment around you as far as we can so that you can play with what you want, you can play with who you want. But, young child, lots of children have felt this way, and most of them grow out of it when they grow up. So let's wait and see. This protocol has been called watchful waiting. Let's wait and see how things develop with you. And when you're an adult, when you've been through puberty, when we know how things are turning out for you, then as an adult, you can make a decision about whether you need to go through life presenting as the opposite sex. What people are now under pressure to do, this is not just counsellors and therapists, but anybody who works with children and parents and family of children. If you suggest to children, well, yes, you think you're of the opposite sex, maybe you really are of the opposite sex. Let's start treating you as if you are of the opposite sex. That's called social transition. You make it very difficult. You cement that belief in the child's psyche that they really are of the opposite sex. And it's then very difficult for them to go back on that.
These parents think they're doing the best for their children by putting them on this path, when what they should be saying to their children is, oh, you're a girl and you like to play football, you like short hair, and you look like a boy. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. When I grew up as a young child, pretty much from the age of 4, I remember I was told when I was 3.5, 4, I got hold of some scissors and went behind the sofa, chopped all my hair off. And my mum went spare. And from the age of about 4, I flat out refused to wear dresses. It was a tantrum, hysteria, if my parents tried to put a dress on me or a skirt or anything. So from the age of sort of 3, 4 onwards, I always had very short hair, always wore either shorts or trousers, and was mistaken for a boy until about the age of 14, to the point where if I went into the female toilets, people would kind of look at me going, why is there a boy in these toilets? I looked like a boy. And I grew up in an Arab country where being a boy was much more fun than being a female. And people would say to me, oh, you want to be a boy, don't you? And I'd kind of be like, yeah, why not? I want to be a boy. I was obsessed with football. I just acted like a boy, and I stereotypically what you'd expect a boy to look like and act like. That was me. Now, thankfully, I had 2 parents who just let me be. They let me play football. They let me look like a boy, act like a boy. They just allowed me to be myself. And lo and behold, I grew up to be a fabulous lesbian. And that's what parents should do.
There is a sense that if you can brand yourself as part of this alphabet oppressed group, then you get points for it. It's socially desirable. And so there's an awful lot of young people who are identifying as bits of that alphabet, where they might not actually be lesbian and gay, but they're calling themselves queer. And then, you know, the poor old gay kids, the poor old lesbian and gay kids, you know, particularly if you're an effeminate boy or you're a butch girl, you're under immense pressure to not to come out as attracted to the same sex, but to transition, to say that you're trans. And everybody loves that. The rest of the school love it because, you know, it's trendy and, you know, we can get excited and we can defend you. And it's sincere, it's deeply sincere. But the problem with it is that, you know, I know of examples where somebody has tried to you know, sort of edge out of the closet, or maybe just the way they conduct themselves, it's fairly obvious to everybody anyway, and they start to talk about you know, young teenage lesbian and gay identities, and they're under terrible pressure to no, you're not, you're trans, and the subtext of it is, if you're trans, we'll be nice to you. If you're just lesbian or gay, not so much.
I saw this tweet when it came out and I thought to myself, what on earth is going on? Now, my own view is that Stonewall is in a very dangerous place. It might once have been a good organization, but when it took on board the trans and trans only, it is just, you know, I struggle. So research suggests that children as young as 2 recognize their trans identity. When I saw that, the very first thing I thought was, oh my goodness, how dangerous this is. The idea that there is a trans identity to begin with, the idea of a gender identity, that is a really contested idea. The one thing we know about identity, it changes throughout life. There isn't anything to ground it. It's amorphous. It's a gossamer that changes with context. But this, to actually impose on education systems and families the idea that your child may have a unique identity known only to themselves, and then to ask schools and nurseries to respond to that, this is, I hesitate to say the word totalitarianism, but this is where it's going. Stonewall are a very dangerous organization these days.
The ideology is actually so bonkers that it's very difficult to get people to believe that they're actually trying to do what they are actually trying to do, right? You know, you still get people coming out being like, they just want to live their lives and just be happy. It's like, if we were just talking about transsexuals who just wanted to live their lives and needed some accommodation to be able to move through the world, then we would not be in this situation. They're not just trying to live their lives. They're trying to redefine the sex question on the census. They're trying to make it impossible for female people to have female-only rape counselling. They're trying to make it impossible for female people to ask for a female healthcare practitioner. They're putting male sex offenders in women's prisons. They're potentially going to destroy women's sport, right? Just for starters, they're pressuring lesbian sexual boundaries. They're sterilising gender non-conforming children. Like, we can go on. Right, that's and that's a lot of that is grounded on this kind of insane sex denialist aspect of the ideology, right? So you come along and you tell people, no, what we're objecting to is like the political erasure of sex, right? We're objecting to the sex question on the census being removed. We're objecting to you destroying the data by which we would be able to measure you know, the pay gap between male people and female people, or the representation of female people in parliament or in any workplace, or how much domestic labour is being done by female people as opposed to male people, or any of the statistics that we would actually need in order to be able to track and challenge the discrimination and oppression of female people. And then people obviously just go, oh, well, that's not happening. That's crazy. No one's denying that. And we're like, look, we have the evidence. This is what is happening.
In terms of the ideas, in terms of the struggle for ideas, the culture war, the craziness over pronouns, I don't think that will last very long. But for this entire generation, the collateral damage is, I think, those kids who are being fast-tracked into it. And we can talk about, you know, I think a reckoning will come. And I think a reckoning must come. You know, as with thalidomide, as with lobotomies, things which were seen as good things, then people realize they are bad things and then they do something about it. In this case, there is a cultural and political argument about whether or not they're good things and suppressing the evidence. And I think it will be nice to have some of the people, the most aggressive, the most influential people who are in the forefront of reassuring their followers, looking at you, that these things are safe, that there is no damage. I think there should be a reckoning for those people, but that's not going to help. If you're a young person, your body has changed for life, and you're sterile, you can't have children, and then you decide you want to. Maybe you got some compensation, but it's probably not going to be enough. So I think there will be a forgotten, damaged generation of people, and there's not. And the only thing we can do for them is to shout about it as loud as we can now, before they make those decisions.
They have made a very large miscalculation because they mistook actual women for their projections, and they misunderstood that women are actually generally quite accommodating until you really, really take the piss and we put a line down, and then we will not fucking move.